Welcome back. We're on our Baroque lecture on Flanders. The main character for today's lecture is Peter Paul Rubens. And once again, I went over the top in providing you every example that I thought you'd be really interested in. So I will breeze past quite a few of them. Feel free to come back and look in more detail at the ones that interest you the most. The ones to look out for: Elevation of the Cross from 1610, the Marie de Medici cycle, specifically the painting, the Marie de Medici, Queen of France, landing in Marseille, completed 1625, and his allegory for the outbreak of war, 1638. We'll also look at one of Rubens' associates, Bruegel, who is a descendant of the Bruegel we already met last unit. We'll look at the work of Van Dyck as well. So this gets kind of complicated. You do not have to know all of the ins and outs of the history here, but I alluded to the fact that Spain had ties to Italy, but also had ties to what we sometimes refer to as the lowlands, the area that includes Holland and Flanders. And that all takes place because of the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, marrying his daughter Marie to Maximilian, who is king of Austria's son. And then when he dies, Burgundy then goes to the Austrian Empire. Then when his daughter dies, the emperor of the Austrian Empire marries a Spanish princess, and so their son inherits Spain and the Netherlands and Austria, as well as some colonies in America. So in a very marriage, war, death kind of succession, Spain eventually gets control of the territory that we looked at in the last unit as Flanders. The easiest way to remember it, and this is kind of cheesy, but it'll probably help you, is to think of The Simpsons' next door neighbor. Flanders is the more religious and more church-going character compared to the Simpsons themselves, and so it's easy to remember Flanders as staying with the church, right? So think of Flanders as the southern portion of the lowlands and staying under the control of Spain. Eventually, the area of Holland will break away, and we'll take a look at that in the next section. So probably the most significant artist to come out of Flanders during the period is Peter Paul Rubens. And so he is definitely a descendant of well-placed family members who had served as diplomats, and he will continue that work into his own career as well. So although he is Flemish, you're going to find that he works all over the Western world at that point. He works in Rome for Cardinal Montalto. He also is a diplomat, the Flemish court to the court of Spain. He will also be sent as a diplomat to England to deal with Charles I. He also do some work for Charles I, King of England, including paintings for the Royal Banqueting House. He definitely is a hugely influential. His first wife passed away in 1626, at which point his second wife was significantly younger than he was. She was only 16 when they wed, and of course that's fairly typical during this period for second wives to be much younger. Rubens definitely owes some of his interests, his ideas, to studying the work of Titian. Titian was definitely someone that he was very, very much influenced by, and that will be very, very important for us going forward, because Rubens eventually will be championed by the artists of the Rococo, which is the last section that we'll look at in Unit 2. The Rococo artists revered Rubens as a colorist, and so a division begins to happen within the Academy over those who favor color or those who favor clarity of drawing. So you can think of Rubens as being the colorist, very much building on the work of Titian. You can also pretty clearly see that he was hugely influenced by Leonardo da Vinci. In fact, this is Rubens' study based on da Vinci's plan for the unfinished mural that we looked at in Florence. And this kind of theme of soldiers on horseback in this kind of contorted, swirling composition will come back again again and again. So Rubens is doing very similar things to what we've seen other Baroque painters, Catholic painters doing. We see liturgy being explored in the narratives. We also see unusual points of view. Again, we're pretty low in this picture, looking kind of forward at the feet of the figures. We're looking through the roof of the temple and out into heaven itself. So the more that you think where your eye is placed in terms of the point of view that you have on your Baroque paintings, the more you're going to see this lower vantage point. Certainly images that allude to sexuality, but with a moral center to it. Of course, we've seen this subject already in a painting by Artemisia Gentileschi. This lecherous older men who surprise Susanna at her bath, and very much you get the feeling from their facial expressions that they're enjoying interaction. And so it's a very prominent story within the Baroque canon. We definitely see Rubens tackling these biblical subjects again and again, and that will be kind of a hallmark through his whole career. So this is his first wife, and you can see that he paints them very well to do. You can see the high fashion that they're wearing, the amount of jewelry that she has. Those fine lace collars are all symbols of their beauty, and it does seem as though the relationship is very much close and loving. If you look at the way he's depicted their hand holding, it seems very much as though they are well-to-do, very happy, very satisfied in their lives and with each other. You can also see some of the Baroque fashion, her clothing in particular. Notice how tightly bound the corseting is around her stomach and the panel that comes down her body below. The idea of trying to keep the torso very much flatter and tighter held into the ribcage is part of the fashion you see in the Baroque. So again, we have these higher light sources coming in from above, and similar somewhat to what Caravaggio is doing. But I think the colors overall you can see are much brighter. And in particular, I think with Rubens, you see quite a lot of use of red in his color schemes. Definitely, as with all Baroque art, there is more appeal to drama, more appeal to gore. You can see that in this image of Prometheus. You can see more mythological subjects and amorous mythological subjects at that. Venus and Adonis, for instance, is pretty clear. But he goes back and forth between the mythical subjects and the religious subjects. So this is the one that I want you to know of his altarpieces made for the Antwerp Cathedral. It's the Elevation of the Cross, completed in 1910. You see in the image that the figure of Christ has been crucified, but the cross itself is being raised into position. So very Caravagesque figures straining at the lower right, pulling on the ropes to raise the figure. You've got very contorted backward bending figure here, lifting and bearing some weight, but you can really feel kind of a Caravaggio influence in this section for sure. You definitely have a subject that you have seen previously, but now you see kind of a response to what's happening in the flanking panel as well. So you've got John and John the Evangelist and Mary on the left, and then you have the Roman soldiers preparing the thieves for crucifixion on the right. It all kind of flows together as, in a way, it's almost one scene, although it is clearly broken into separate panels that don't exactly connect one to the other. You really get the feeling, though, that these figures are responding to what's happening here. Notice that these figures are all kind of aiming inward. These are aiming inward to center, and we've got this diagonal composition, much more dynamic, I think, than what we saw in some of the Renaissance depictions of this theme. It's less symmetrical, it's less centered, it doesn't have the Christ figure already raised in position and just sort of hanging in space, looked at by other figures. You get a feeling of this as a scene of action. And so definitely when the painting is seen, I think, person, you get a feeling that Rubens is doing something a little bit different with the painting in order to try to contemporize it, to make people feel like action is happening to them. You can clearly see an influence of Caravaggio, I think, right? I mean, this is literally a re-envisioning of Caravaggio's idea on the same theme. So clearly these artists are very well aware of what's going on, what is contemporary style, and how to kind of make those ideas their own through this exploration of making a duplicate, making a copy, or making an homage. So again, back and forth between mythological subject and religious subject, and most of those paintings do have, the mythological ones in particular, have a little bit brighter color scheme, feel a little bit perhaps more like the work of Michelangelo in terms of color. Another altarpiece from Antwerp, from the Cathedral of Our Lady. This one is the Descent from the Cross, and it also has kind of a compatible movement in the composition, although it moves the opposite direction from the others. It's really kind of interesting to see. On the right-hand side, you've got the visitation of Mary and Elizabeth. Sorry, on the left, you have the presentation of Mary, visitation of Mary to Elizabeth, rather, and the presentation of the infant Christ at the temple in Jerusalem is the scene that's happening on the right. I got all twisted there. Sorry. So you can see that he's somewhat set these characters, particularly in the visitation panel, as if it's happening in kind of a contemporary culture. The clothing and even the architecture feels a little bit closer to Flanders than it does to ancient Rome. You definitely feel with Rubens that he is body and beauty in forms that are perhaps not typical of what we saw in the Renaissance. The figures do tend to be a little bit more voluptuous, especially in comparison to our culture's strange beauty expectations as well. So Rubens knows his foreshortening, he knows drama, he knows how to put you in the scene and make you feel that you're a part of it, very much the way Caravaggio and his followers are capable of doing. This is his incredulity of Thomas, or doubting Thomas, less physical than the piece that we saw by Caravaggio as well. Definite here in the writing of the Gospels by the four evangelists, and you can see the communication between God and through the angel figure. Pretty awesome. That central figure is really pretty disturbing, right? Venus threatened. Pretty remarkable piece. He definitely does also allegory paintings or allegorical paintings, and so you will sometimes find logical subjects will begin to have characters in them that stand for really important concepts. In particular, themes of peace quite a lot, and Rubens very clearly comes down on the side of peace, on the idea of ending war, and you see that again and again in his allegorical works. Definitely there's an increased interest, I think, in animals, and especially fierce creatures, and that is going to have a big impact on artists following into Unit 3 who are fans of what Rubens is all about. Again, that contrast, male, female, monstrous, beautiful, those kinds of subjects we've seen all the way back through the early part of the Renaissance. Use really is this one, the hippopotamus crocodile hunt, is a pretty fascinating image that swirls around that center point of a very fierce battle between crocodiles, hippopotami, and hunters, and it owes a lot to what Leonardo was doing, for sure. Rubens also is able to get away with making landscapes because he includes little narrative scenes in them, and that's a theme that comes up in the Baroque quite a bit as well. Really beautiful image. This is perhaps one of the oddest, most unusual mythological subjects. It is a pretty and complicated story, but essentially it has to do with the god Vulcan, and you see his statue toward the back. Vulcan inadvertently creates a child with Mother Earth, and Mother Earth is kind of horrified creature that she now has that has a serpent's tail instead of legs, or in some versions that it just is beside a serpent. You see that in the basket at the forefront. And so the goddesses who are in charge of caring for this child, the daughters of Cecrops, the king of Attica, sort of demi-goddess figures, are so horrified by him that they end up committing suicide. So you can clearly see that there. The most unusual element in the painting, I think, quite frankly, is the multi-breasted statue to the back that is meant to represent the goddess of the earth. So a very unusual mythological subject. We really haven't seen anything quite like this. But you definitely get a feeling with Rubens' work that you're feeling almost in painting the kind of movement and three-dimensionality that we saw in the sculptures of Bernini, even in the subject matter. More and more allegorical paintings come into Rubens' body of work, in particular pieces that his friend and colleague, Jan Bruegel the Elder, who is a descendant, of course, of Peter Bruegel, the peasant Bruegel painter that in Unit 1. So Rubens again returns to mythological scenes, alternating pretty frequently back and forth between scenes from mythology like Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, and then to biblical subjects like Judith and Holofernes. His version of Judith, I think, owes a little bit to Artemisia's version, at least in her face and in her determination. More famous mythological scenes. The use of the word in the title is the way that it historically was used. Titling. We would probably translate that title today to abduction, because that's what is depicted, but of course the result of the abduction is implied by the way we use the term today. So this is definitely not a pleasant romantic scene, but it a mixture of Leonardo's rearing horses with Michelangelo's sculpting of the female body. We really start to feel the believable and anatomy of these figures very clearly. And I think that you can see in Rubens' work, definitely there is a mixture of ideas coming from earlier art. He's fusing them into something brand new, something of his own. Again, he does do work throughout his career with his friend and occasional artistic partner, Jan Bruegel, particularly in the allegories. We see lots of allegorical paintings. There are lots of altarpiece paintings as well, much in this tradition of making us feel as if we are part of the scene. And if we really look carefully, we can see his penchant for diagonal compositions, as in the Descent from the Cross. The theme of the hunt, I said, was going to come back again and again, right? This is one of the more intriguing pieces. This is the Fall of the Damned, which I sometimes equate in my own mind with the Last Judgment painting by Michelangelo. It really does give us a terrifying vision of what hell is. Into those details, you can see some of the figures being almost grouped into categories for different types of torment based on the sins that they practiced during their lives. It's a really frightening vision of hell. But of course, we've seen that in Northern Renaissance work as well. So continuing that tradition beyond just the references to Leonardo, Michelangelo, and of course the influence of Caravaggio. Definitely have the work of a painter who is in demand, and he's an artist who is going to make work for many of the leading royal families of Europe at this point. And you can see things that he pulls again and again and again. This is probably the sister of his second wife, so we get a sort of a glimpse of what his wife probably looked like. We see working for multiple royal families. As I said, here's Philip IV of Spain. We last saw him painted by Velázquez, and you can clearly see that they both are dealing with a need to make the king recognizable, but also aggrandize him somewhat. And I would argue that Velázquez's piece is maybe a to the actual face of the king, but you clearly can see that connection to working for the royalty. So remember that Rubens is a very successful artist at this point, and he does something kind of unusual, especially with the larger canvases. We often think of a painter as being a master of the art they create, making all of the work themselves, start to finish. But we know that artists had workshops, they had assistants, they had apprentices, Renaissance, and that workshop continues. Even though we now have training through the academies, the workshop idea continues. And so Rubens very often will commissions and do the design work and paint the major and most important figures, but leave lesser figures, animals, life, background, sky, trees, to his assistants. So there's no way he could have produced the sheer volume of work that he made in his lifetime if there hadn't been assistants to help him making those pieces. You can also see that his work during the 60s is being revered, is received and revered well by other artists. This is an homage to Rubens making a painting, and it's by an Italian painter. So you can see that this transfer of ideas, or the respect for one another's work, is not just everyone bowing down to Italian masters. The reference is just for good art, and so it's not that only Italians would be the best artists. The artist's second wife, really beautiful, sumptuous gown that she's in there. Rubens' painting of Pythagoras convinces us to be vegetarian. It's pretty entertaining as well. This idea of not eating animals is an idea that Leonardo espoused. The Europa painting is, again, a very familiar piece in Rubens' work, and again, it is a hallmark of interest in mythological subjects. But as I said before, of course, he back and forth between our biblical and mythological scenes. The mythological ones spill into the allegories. The allegorical paintings can sometimes include people in contemporary Flemish attire, surrounded by Putti and other figures of mythological love, and we'll start to see this having an impact, particularly on French painting in the next section on the Rococo. Any attempt at a landscape is always interesting for us to see, because so frequently we think of landscape as being a lesser category, especially during the Baroque, when the Academy ruled that history painting was the apex of what an artist should do. And a history painting, of course, the subject can only be images from actual history, images from the Bible, or from mythology. So when we see a genre scene mashed with a landscape, usual move away from what is considered the best type of art that an artist could create. I suppose if you're Rubens, then you can get away with those kind of deviations, because Rubens was in high demand throughout Europe. And in fact, what you're looking at now are paintings that he did for the court of King Charles, or sorry, for Charles, but glorifying King James in London. And what you see above are all the paintings that he did for the ceiling, very famous building designed by the architect Inigo Jones, known as the Banqueting House in London. So if you can imagine, this is sort of a separate from the palace, a completely separate freestanding building at a distance, some remove from the palace, that is specifically for holding state events. You have, obviously, lavish dinners would be held here, but you could also use it for hosting parties, soirees, balls, all kinds of meeting absolute elite of the cultures of Europe, and all of that taking place beneath the paintings of none other than Peter Paul Rubens. So if you're the king, and you can commission work from the absolute best artists in the world. I love that Rubens' figures are not all little skinny, tiny people. They look more real. He definitely is, I think, interested in showing us his interest in the female in particular. And he does continue a tradition that we saw in some of the paintings from Bruegel in the Renaissance. We saw a lot of these peasant scenes, and here's Rubens kind of playing on that idea as well. That may be his wife sort of a randy genre scene. But again, he's always going to come back to biblical stories. Another landscape genre combination, really remarkable in his career. The allegory I want you to know for the test is this one, the allegory of the outbreak of war from 1638. Was made for the Grand Duke of Tuscany. It absolutely is a reference to a socio-political conflict that was happening, the 30 Years' War, which actually lasted a bit longer than that. But the 30 Years' War is sort of a conflict between some of the leading European powers, and it broke apart. And Rubens, as citizen of Flanders, but a citizen of the world, having worked as a diplomat and an artist for so many families, is well placed to make a statement about what he sees as the tragedy of war. And that's what this painting is all about. It is really one of his most compelling allegorical works because it's a little over the top in its drama, but it has such an important message that I think we can still relate to today, maybe even more so than some of the other allegories. You see in the center characters that we've talked about a lot this semester, Venus and Mars, god of war, and they are united, they are lovers, but at the same time they are polar opposites. And so there's a lot you could read into that from a psychological standpoint: male, female, love, hate, these sort of archetypal emotions or states of mind or states of being are embodied by these two imaginary characters, but we kind of dress them up in a way as human beings in this conflict. And you can see that Venus only wants love to exist. She's trying to keep the god of war from destroying, because I think that's her point of view, and I think also that war might be necessary, it might help end conflicts, there might be an occasion when it has to occur, but at the same time it is a destructive force. So if you look at the foot of the god of war, he is trampling printed books, and he's about to trample musical instruments. Is that culture, poetry, and drama, and music, and all of the arts are going to be destroyed by this. So really the allegory of the outbreak of war for him is like a cry, please don't allow this to continue. Portrait of the wife and their son, beautiful. And then definitely pieces I want you to be aware of. This is an incredible commission that he received. This is the Marie de Medici cycle. Now, we talked about these complex intermarriages when we were talking about just the history of Flanders itself, but here's another complex marriage story. Marie de Medici, the Medici, of course, are Italian, but Marie de Medici weds Henry, who is the King of France. And so we have an Italian queen of France being painter, if you can get your mind around that. The borders between the countries, I think, in some respects are important politically, but then from an artistic point of view, they're much more fluid. It's not as if Marie wanted an Italian painter. She wanted the best painter of this type of work, and so she puts the commission in Rubens' hands, and it's a really good choice on her part. Now, sadly, her husband, Henry, dies before the commission can be completed. So she'd actually asked Rubens to paint a series of paintings showing the history of her life, and then a series showing the history of, and that did not come to pass because of his untimely death. In an interesting twist, she also gets into a conflict with Louis XIII, who is her son, and Louis tries to take power away from her, and that's even depicted in these paintings of her life. So that brings us to a vocab term. What you're seeing is known as a painting cycle. A painting cycle tells a story almost like a comic strip in a way. It's a series of panels or campaigns that tell sections of a narrative story. And so the story of Marie's life is depicted here on a grand scale. You can see how large the paintings are in the museum looking at them. And there are really interesting elements in the story. You can go back over each one on your own if you wish, but I'd pull a couple to your attention just because they're interesting. Marie's birth and education. Isn't this exactly what things were like when you were born? The gods and goddesses to welcome you to the earth, and then hired the Graces and other gods like Mercury to be your tutors, your teachers. It's kind of an obviously these are not meant to be realistic in any way. They are, again, kind of laying on the mythological and allegorical aspects of his interests. I think this is my personal favorite in some ways because it's so funny. It's almost like a dating app from the era. What you're seeing is on the battlefield, pausing his own war, and you see that the god of war is right there behind him, and the god of war is overcome as he is presented with a portrait of his potential queen. And you can see the king is so in love with her that he has to stop the battle. He's only going to swipe on her. I think this is certainly who he's going to marry. In fact, they were married by proxy, that actually the official wedding ceremony, they were not present. So that's kind of an odd case as well. The uncle of the bride, Grand Duke Ferdinand of Tuscany, stood in for the king. In the background there is a portrait of Rubens watching the scene. The one to know for the test is this one landing of Marie de Medici at Marseille, disembarking from her boat. So you can kind of see aspects of the rigging of the boat behind her. She's coming down a covered area and a gangplank to shore. And you can see that she's surrounded by her attendants. Angels are flying in. River and water gods and nymphs are flitting. But even more compelling is this figure, who is an allegorical figure representing the nation of France itself bowing down in front of her. So obviously that's not meant as a photographically real depiction of how this event happened. It is filled with the symbol figures representing the ideas of the Christian Church, Catholic Church, the mythological history of European culture, this figure of the nation itself bowing before its new queen. Pretty remarkable painting in its own right. Then the rest of her life story plays out over the course of the other paintings, and you can see conflict with her son after she claims the throne. They get into conflict, and she is superior over him. They eventually repair their differences. You can see here he is trying to take control of the rudder, the ship of state. She's not having it. So they do come into conflict. They do negotiate. There's some major moments where we fear for the life of the queen, but they do reconcile. So it all comes out good in the end. An artist definitely to know, obviously, as we've seen with Rubens, is Jan Bruegel the Elder. He is the son of Peter Bruegel the Elder. The sons added the H in the spelling of the name. So you can sometimes find Peter Bruegel the Elder, the father, the one we studied last unit. You can sometimes find references to him with the H in the name spelling, but he tended not to use it. His sons tended to use it. So there are, of course, two sons. We're going to look specifically, though, at Jan Bruegel. Jan Bruegel was nicknamed Velvet Bruegel because his paintings were so sumptuous for still lives, flowers, sensuous things that would be displayed on top of woven fabrics that would be covering tables. So the sense of luxury items kind of becomes associated with Jan Bruegel the Elder. The series that you're seeing just a portion of here is the series based on the five senses, and this is the sense of sight. So another allegory. An allegory is essentially a visual image, symbolic visual storytelling, and that's what's happening here. The figure, this nude female figure, represents the idea, the concept of this abstract thing, sight. And so the painting is full of everything, theoretically, that a person could see. I mean, there is the entire world, right? There's a globe. There's the suggestions of the heavens, so the whole universe. We've got plants in a still life, astronomical equipment. We've got a landscape with land, water, sky, buildings. You've got the architecture inside, and then you also have paintings that represent all of the different types of art and visual ideas you can see. And who's in there but our old pal Peter Paul Rubens, his painting based so much on the style and idea of Leonardo. So it really is kind of a masterpiece of everything that one could see. Note for the test is this one, the allegory of the earth, which I think is kind of a sweet one. It gives us a sense of the story of the Garden without leaning so heavily on just the aspects of original sin and the loss of the garden. So you see animals together, conditions that they could never be in the real world. You would never have predatory felines beside horned mammals that would otherwise. It's kind of remarkable painting in and of itself. Next, we'll turn our attention to Anthony van Dyck, who is a member of the Flemish circle of painters and worked for a while in Rubens' workshop, believe it or not, but eventually becomes court painter to Charles I in England. So transition for artists to seek work with the highest paying, best available clients. And Van Dyck becomes court painter to Charles, and we see Charles here in a court painting very different than the way that Velázquez painted his king. It was presented more as a member of the court, as a soldier, as a member of royalty, and in this painting it's just casual. I mean, obviously he's wearing silk and satin and velvet, and he looks a little too fancy perhaps to just be some peasant out for a stroll, but he's not on a throne. He's not in a battle setting. He's going about a leisure activity associated with the upper classes to this day in England. The idea of hunting, fishing, and shooting, their leisure elite class tradition. And that's sort of what Charles is trying to do, is kind of make him seem somewhat of the people. There are definitely hundreds of other examples that we could look at, and I encourage you to come back and take a look at some of the other examples by Rubens.